Are you guys ready? This is going to be something. I mean it, actually. This is going to be a lot of fun. So, today we're going to talk about responsive web design. But actually, that's a lie. We're going to talk about responsive design as we actually know it back in the 60s and 70s. Now, this is scary, right? And it should be. But let me start with something else first. So the first thing I do when I come to a new city is exploring its beauty. So I went ahead and explored Nantes. And I found out that you have lots of planes coming in all the time, have lots of weird characters on the walls, which is quite cute, actually. I like them a lot. Really nice. I also like typography. I'll kind of make pictures of buildings and house numbers and stuff. Really beautiful stuff, really beautiful typography. I like it a lot. Like things like that, it's just remarkable. I really love it, right? And also house numbers, they have their own personality, which I like a lot. It's really, really cute. And that, I like this one a lot for some reason. But you have some weird interfaces going on as well. Now, well, it's kind of repeated twice what you have to do. Like you have the buttons. So I tried to, push these buttons and they didn't work. So this kind of worked. But it's like the same interface. It's kind of a bit weird, but interesting. You have very dark humor as well. I don't know if you can see it or not. Which is kind of cute in a way. But again, you are pirates anyway. And you have this stuff going on, right? And this is scary. It's like doorknobs. Ooh, this is like, okay, this is just weird. But again, you are pirates, so I guess you're used to it anyway. But you have wonderful flowers, and you have beautiful scenery, and I like landscapes and everything. It's really, really cool. So I love being here. Thanks for inviting me. Now, my name is Vitaly. I forgot to mention that. And I'm known for two things. First being, I never finish my talks in time. So it was not a good idea to set me at 9 a.m. Just saying. And the second one, I'm editor-in-chief and co-founder of Smashing Magazine, online magazine for designers and developers. And this is what it looks like. So how many of you know Smashing Magazine? Oh, please keep your hands up. I am prepared. So I can't see anything, but please keep your hands up. Everyone. Oh, I can't see anything. Oh, thank you. Oh, somebody has two hands. I like that. That's like motivation. I like that. But we're not going to talk about responsive design today, of course. We're going to start with a little story. And it's story time, so you have to get comfortable on the couch, right? Sit down and enjoy the company. So let's talk about the little story first. 1892, the Illustrated Phonographic World, right? They published a nice article about the so-called type art. Type art is what you can do with, in art with basic characters, like lowercase o, uppercase a, and stuff like that. So of course you had typewriters, but some crazy people went ahead and created this kind of illustrations and art out of these characters on typewriters. 1892, right? And of course it wasn't perceived well. People thought, well, they're just misusing the technology, they're just misusing what they do, and it's just weird. Nobody does stuff like that. It has no purpose, right? But it evolved over time, and in fact some things didn't have any purpose. Now this is just art, like Bauhaus time, right? Where they kind of played around with X's and O's and zeros and stuff like that. But it was interesting at the time still. Now, a couple of years later, the Art Typing magazine came out. Art Typing was all about the so-called art type. What can you do with type, right? This one was published in 1939, actually, and then revisited in 1940. So they started with basic stuff, what you can do with these little characters. You can do, some basic patterns. At the same time, it evolved over time, it got more complicated, more advanced. You had to do some frames later on, you could do this stuff. So people kind of tended to come up with patterns that you can use out of these little characters, right? And everybody has to draw a fish, so they drew a fish. And everybody had to draw a robot, so everybody drew a robot, right? Out of these little characters. And it got more advanced, the car, and everything. And of course, some people still did this crazy stuff that, is just art and is an expressionism, basically. But it's interesting to see this happening. It's just remarkable to see this happening. And of course, then something happened that changed the world forever. The teletext came. Who remembers teletext? Who remembers Minitel? Ah, I see. Okay, right? Teletext was a big invention. Now, if you think about it, if we didn't have the internet today, we all would be teletext designers and developers. We would all be designing in teletext and developing for teletext. Now, in 1973, CFAX came. It was an invention by Philips and BBC. It was just a way to communicate information asynchronously, which was really a big deal at the time, a really big deal. And BBC was the first using it, but over time, of course, it came into the household TVs. So people started using it, and this is what it looked like back in the 60s, right? Now, of course, you have to think about it because, well, we were using it, or some people were using it. Well, I'm not that old, okay? But somebody had to design every single page. So there was a job description which was called a teletext designer, right? Which is quite remarkable if you think about it. So these poor people had to draw things pixel by pixel, so to say, as we would say today, right? Move things around in this condensed space because they have just a couple of pages to fill, right? Trying to come up with some sort of mechanisms to make it work, to make it easier for them. Also patterns and libraries and stuff like that. And it wasn't easy. So over time, it got more evolved, and in Germany, it was really, really big. In France, you had Minitel, which is like the cool invention ever. I would love to see one. I think somebody told me that there is one outside somewhere here, right? Which is like a really big deal, really cool. And Teletel evolved over time as well. So it got color, it got more advanced, and people still did this crazy stuff, right? But, you know, people always do this crazy stuff. But, and this is an important point, at that time, when teletext was a big deal, designers, teletext designers, came up with this kind of pattern libraries, or this kind of systems or tools that would enable them to create these pages on the fly. So they wouldn't have to draw every single page one by one, every single block of content element one by one, but instead they would use this kind of a tool for that. And of course, they also created pattern libraries like that, right? Where you have all the different colors, perhaps some basic styling and stuff like that. Very much like what we as web designers are doing today as well. Now, this is pretty cool, right? Now, at the same time, back in 1983, something happened that also changed, well, at least in the US, changed a lot. So what do you think is the most popular publication in the US? The Bible? No. Any ideas? The TV Guide, right? It's the most popular publication in the US. Now, it emerged in 1953. And of course, it looked like this, nothing special. It was a print edition, right? Had lots of columns, and basically you have just a description of every TV show or every TV program, right? So the editors would go ahead and for every single TV show or for every single movie would write, things like that, just a basic description. And it didn't really evolve over time. It got more pictures maybe, but it didn't really evolve until teletext came. Because teletext was supposed to become big in the US as well. Well, to be honest, it never made it to the US. But TV Guide team thought that it will be a big deal, so they wanted to be prepared. Now, TV Guide evolved over time, but the most important, the most crucial thing they actually changed, the decision they made back in 1983, that changed a lot for them, was to think about what would happen if teletext came to the US. So they could have done something that we are doing today with iPad apps and iPhone apps, just encapsulating content in one single medium, trying to make it work there. And they could do the same thing, trying to create some kind of a TV guide for teletext, but just encapsulated in one single framework. But instead, they created a content API. So they asked the editors for every single TV show that they were writing about to create some kind of a free, well, basically content API, where you would write not just the basic description that we had on the previous slide, but also short form, shorter form, long form, and the one with metadata in it, like the length of the movie, the characters who are playing, and so on. So they were prepared for everything that came later. And this decision was made in 1983. So teletext didn't make it to the US, but of course, in the US, TiVo is a big deal. The moment TiVo came out, they were ready for this, because the API existed for 20 years, right, already. So they were ready for this just because they made this decision about content APIs. And in the end, you can actually even use it on your mobile phone if you want to. Teletext on the mobile phone, how crazy is that, right? But you can use it if you want to. Now, this is just a little story that kind of goes back. But I think we can learn a lot from this little story. So I want to talk about two things today. The first one is how can we actually encapsulate some of the lessons we can learn from teletext and from Minitel when designing responsive websites today. And I want to finish with a nice case study of how The Guardian did it, right? So the first part is maybe a bit more theoretical, while the second one is really practical. So again, teletext, talking about systems, so we have to design systems as well. Now, when we think about responsive design, this is kind of this image that we have in our heads, right? Not very happy with it. I like this quote by Tim Brown, who said that designing for the web is like visualizing a tesseract. Tesseract is a complex hypercube. We build experiences by manipulating the shadows. Ooh, shadows, right? But actually, this is exactly what we do on the web today. We can't make too many assumptions. We just don't know what the user is or not going to do, right? So we're trying to grasp in the dark and try to figure out what to create and what kind of a system to create to make it work among all the devices. This is why when I think about responsive design, I think about this graph, which has an immense complexity, right? Be it screen density, be it typography, be it performance, everything. And it's a big, big deal. And this is why we all are very cool people, right? Because dealing with this is very, very hard, right? So what we as designers have to do is just putting all the right dots in all the right order along all the right axes to make sure we create some kind of a system that works. And responsive design is one of the approaches that helps do it, makes it work. But of course, we know that's also a new mindset. It's not just a couple of techniques like CSS media queries, fluid grids, and flexible images. It's a new mindset that requires us to rethink and extend our practices. But it can be quite hard. This is why many clients think that this is true. Okay, you do your research, information architecture, visual interface design, front end, but now making it all responsive, now that would cost money, right? This is kind of a general understanding that most clients have. And no wonder that we have cases like this happening. The CNN iOS app is so bad, I took the unprecedented steps of deleting it and reinstalling it just so I could delete it again, right? There are so many bad native apps out there. Again, thinking back about TV Guide decision, well, they could have created a content API to make it accessible and available for everyone, right? But instead, they locked this content inside a really badly designed native app, making it inaccessible for everyone, except poor users who are using this app, right? Now, but the thing is, it doesn't have to be so difficult. It doesn't have to take much more time. It doesn't have to cost much more money. Responsive design is not that hard. Of course, if you're kind of switching from a fixed width layouts to responsive design, it will be hard at first. But once you have your kind of a system in place, when you know what you're doing, this doesn't have to take more money, cost more money, and doesn't have to take more time. Now, we have a lot of stuff to do as responsive designers. We have to think about all the components: flexible grid, typography, navigation, accessible form controls, carousel, step navigation, responsive tables, accordions, media list, drop-downs, pagination, data tables, buttons, icon fonts. Right? We have to be strategic about our design decisions because we want to be future-proof. Responsive images, how do we deal with them? Typography, accessibility, legacy browser support, internationalization, localization, performance budgets, interactions, animations. How do we deal with ads? Right? And you think we are done? Because we are not. At some point, we have to think about layouts as well. Right? All kind of layouts, be it homepage layout, checkout, product page layout. Now it's a good time to make picture. Oh, one person done it. That's nice. 2, or 3, or 4. Nice. Right? So this is a lot of work. Now, one of the approaches to make it all work, to kind of be able to approach this complexity, is atomic design. How many of you are familiar with atomic design? 2.5, third, quarter? Okay, so atomic design is very, very simple. The idea is the following. You basically separate your whole design process into 5 parts. The first one, the basic one, is atoms. You're creating atoms. These are the basic units that you have in your design. It could be a little button, could be a little form, could be a little input field, something like that. You combine these atoms to create molecules. You combine the molecules to create organisms. Out of organisms, you create templates, and out of templates, you create pages, and then you have your website. Now, this is a basic example for that. You have your basic units, which are atoms, label, input, and button. You combine them, you create a molecule. This is the search box, right? You combine it, well, you create something like an organism, which is a header in this case. You have a logo, a navigation, and the search box. You add more elements like that, and you create something like a wireframe, a template, right? And then at some point, you add your content, and you have your page. Now, this is now groundbreaking news. That's not, too complicated. It's quite easy, actually. But this is important because if you think about it from the very start, and you design your components from the very start, this is going to be much, much easier. So, but what does it mean, designing components or starting with basic units? Well, you know Twitter Bootstrap, right? Many of you, maybe? Right. So Twitter Bootstrap, I'm not talking about going ahead and just taking Twitter Bootstrap and reskinning it and creating a new theme for it, but instead creating something like a tiny Bootstrap for every single client that you have, right? So you're creating these components as something that doesn't look like Twitter Bootstrap, but has all the different components you need in your design. So when you start a new project, you need to identify the components first. And there are examples of how it can be done. So this is a pattern library, which contains all the different components, most important components, including the description, the preview, the code sample, and the usage notes, right? It's just a big, big set of components. Now, you might be asking me, wait a second. I can't just go ahead and create all these atoms first, and then hope that it will magically work when I put it all together on my web page, right? It doesn't work this way. And it doesn't. This is why when you start designing a project, you don't start with a little component only. You kind of move always between the organisms and templates, somewhere there, just to have a good understanding of where the visual direction goes, right? Just to have a really clear understanding of how it goes. So you have to change the atoms rarely, but you have to change molecules and organisms a lot. So this is the area where you move. So when you start a new project, you don't go ahead in Photoshop and say, I want to have a canvas page of a size of 1,200 pixels times 1,000 pixels. But instead, I want to have a new canvas page of 10,000 pixels times 10,000 pixels. And this is my canvas, where I draw all the elements, important components first, and then try to combine them better. So, just another example of the same thing. Now, you might be wondering, okay, well, wait a second, who does that? I mean, we're designing components first, but they have to be prototyped. And these pattern libraries, do we have to design them from scratch? No, of course not. Because, of course, if you're designing components, it's quite easy to create prototypes in the browser, especially if you're working with a designer or developer right with you. So what you do is the following. You write your components, you prototype in HTML and CSS really fast. You can do it really fast. And as you do that, you also add a documentation in your CSS and in your markup and in your JavaScript. And all these pattern libraries, which you saw right now, is generated on the fly. Right? So you don't have to do any extra code because you're a smart designer or developer. You're writing documentation anyway, right? Right? I guess. So this whole thing will be generated for you automatically on the fly. So every single time you change a component, it will be regenerated for you automatically. So there is nobody who has to maintain the whole thing or build it from scratch. It's just there. And the reason why it's so cool is because it's so difficult to be inconsistent and wrong. Because, well, the whole library is consistent by its nature. So if you want to introduce errors, it's very difficult. Because you actually have to take this component and you need to reuse it. Right? So it's very, very nice in this view. So you can use things like living style guide, which actually lives in your CSS and HTML and JavaScript. Or you can use style doco, or you can use KSS, which is all the same thing. And this is what it looks like. You just have documentation for your components as you build them. And then the whole thing is generated for you. Now, this is kind of an abstract approach. So we're talking about components, but how do we actually make it work in real-life projects, right? What would the workflow look like? Now, the design process is sometimes weird and complicated because it involves people and organizations, which often are weird and complicated, right? And you are probably familiar with it. Now, humans are weird creatures. Like, designing for humans is the worst, right? But we kind of have to deal with it as long as we don't have aliens. So this is what the linear workflow looks like in most companies. Well, you have your design stage. It's being handed off to the front-end guys. They do their work. It's being sent off to the back-end guys. They do their work. And at some point, it's launched. At this point, sometimes you think about users, maybe, right? And at this point, we kind of throw in some content, because actually we should have it, before the project starts, but we never have it before the project starts. So we just throw in some content in the end, and boom, right? This is how it works. Now, it can be a bit better, of course. We start with the content, we go to the UX phase, design, front-end and back-end, and launch, right? It's kind of nicer, but still not quite perfect because of this. So now we have to do the same thing with responsive design. Right, so maybe like this, right? It's front-end, responsive design is media queries and, this kind of stuff. So it's just front-end now. It's front-ender's job. But as it turns out, you have to think about performance as well, so you have to think about back-end. Design patterns are different, so you have to think about design as well. So everything wants to be responsive, but it can't, right? And especially if you, still working in Photoshop and try to deliver PSDs as your deliverable, this is going to be a nightmare. Because for every single component, or for every single page, we have to design lots of versions of it. And every single time the client wants to change a little thing, you have to do it 12 times. Now, you don't want that, right? So this is suboptimal. Now, why the hell do we have this linear workflow? Well, because it nicely reflects the organizational structures we have in most companies. You have people who code, they're sitting on the first floor. You have people who design. Sometimes they're sitting in a different building, different country, maybe in a different room, but they're physically separated. And we don't want to talk to each other, right? We use Skype and email. It's much more convenient, right? So they don't talk, and as a result, you have projects being delayed, especially responsive projects, being delayed and costing way too much money. So this is because we have people who plan, people who design, people who code, all separated. Now, please, okay, stand in the light, please. Okay, I will be standing in the light now, I guess. Sorry about that, I ruined everything for you. That's nice. I like that, that's nice. Well, here's a ball for you to make you happy. Oh, well then I throw one at you. So who is under a lot of pressure these days? Like really difficult projects, maybe? Okay, so we have an insurance here? Okay. Okay, this is going to be nuts. Oh, all right. Somebody else? Give me something like it. Oh, you are. All right, this is going to be interesting. I've never done this before. Okay. That's fun. We have books too. Okay, should not do that. All right, okay, back to the topic now. Right, so we have this problem with the teams, right? So Trent Walton has an idea. So what if we build smaller tactical teams that are capable of executing multiple rounds of planning, design, and code quickly and independently, right? So instead of what we saw just now, we could have something like this. Independent teams being able to work on every single component independently, right? So what does it mean? Okay, so we start a new project with building all-round teams. We think mobile first. It's kind of a best practice. It's actually easier if you want to deal with content right away. You produce this so-called style tiles or style guide or components first, designing the modules in Photoshop. You build prototypes in the browser right away because you're working directly with the developer. You start with atoms and then you kind of increase the fidelity as you go. And you have this collaboration as in-browser design pairing. Again, working together with the developer all the time. And clients have to do a bit more work because they have kind of new deliverables. They're not getting PhDs anymore. They're getting this. They're getting style guides and prototypes that they have to sign off. They're getting something that we designers call core content functionality priority lists, where when you start a project, you have to be really clear about what the main content is, what the core content is for the user. You have to get a sign-off on performance and UX budgets, meaning, we'll talk about it in a bit, but performance budget is basically a way of saying, I want the site to load within 2.5 seconds on 3G in Nantes with this kind of a round trip time, right? So this is my threshold. So if a designer comes to you or your boss comes to you and says, I want to add a carousel on the page, you can say, sorry mate, I don't have a budget for you, right? But just being very clear about what performance means for the client is very important. And the same for UX, which is basically how much time it would take for a critical task to be completed, right? Like checkout or filling in the web form and stuff like that. Also have to be very clear about legacy browser support and what do you do with images. Because if you want to have a really nice responsive site this fast, you have to deal with responsive images as well. Now, this is what it could look like. This is something like that looks not like a website, but it kind of gives you an overall visual impression of where the design is heading, right? It's just a set of components. So when you start a new project again, you could create something like this, a project hub, where all the drafts and all the sign-offs and all the usability studies and all the important documents go, right? And you start designing there as well. So your client, when he or she wants to see an update, just get on the page and see what's going on, right? And when you start working in the project, you start with the element explorations, which looks like this, right? Like this, right? Just a bunch of elements, more or less refined, combined together on one single page. So as you scroll, you get a feeling of what it's going to feel like. They're just images exported from Photoshop, right? It's not a big deal. But it's not a web page exported from Photoshop, which is a big, big difference, right? And as you go, it gets more refined, it gets more detailed. But again, because you're designing these components, later on it will be very difficult to introduce inconsistency because you're just combining them as Lego blocks, right? And you go further, and you're getting sign-offs on this instead of actual web pages, right? Does it make any sense at all? Who doesn't care anymore at this point? Some people? Okay, that's fine. So, and sometimes you would introduce something like this, a responsive layout behavior, where you identify the most important components that you have here on the left, header, home, key visual, and so on. Then you have something like a map, responsive map, where you have different sizes, XS, small, medium, large, XL, and so on. And you kind of define how the component change, or a component changes, depending on the resolution that you have, right? And this could be a sign-off as well. Now, this is a workflow that works in many companies I worked with. Not always, but it is better and takes not so much time as Photoshop mockups do. But the most important thing we have to talk about today is performance. Because responsive design has this bad reputation of being almost always fed by default, taking too much time to load, all assets being downloaded by all devices. There is no granular control about what's being loaded, what's being delivered and not. But this is not true. If somebody tells you that responsive design is fat, well, tell them that they are liars. Because there are options you can use to make responsive design really fast. And it's not, designers, it's not responsive design's fault that many websites are fat. It's developers' fault and designers' fault that they're fat. So let's talk about performance to kind of reveal this truth. So obviously nobody likes waiting. I don't like waiting. Do you? I don't think that anybody likes waiting, right? Now, not only waiting is a problem on mobile and on responsive websites in general, but also roaming is a big problem. So you don't want to end up with charges like this at the end of the month, right? Just because you're traveling to a different country. So I did a little experiment. I was in Moscow 5 months ago, and I'm using T-Mobile in Germany. I live in Germany, so I'm using T-Mobile. So T-Mobile kind of groups all countries into 3 groups, categories, right? Friendly countries, you have to pay 53 euro cents per megabyte. Not so friendly countries, and not friendly countries at all, right? So Russia, you can just guess where Russia is, right? So France is friendly. Argentina is far away, but it's quite friendly, right? Russia and Afghanistan, the same thing. Iraq, doesn't matter. Russia, Afghanistan, Iraq, the same thing. In Russia, for roaming in Moscow, you're paying 79 euro cents per 50 kilobyte of data. per 50 kilobyte of data. Let's try it again. In Russia, you pay 79 euro cents per 50 kilobyte of data, right? This is just nuts, right? This is just crazy. So, if you want to load the full front page of vogue.co.uk in Moscow, you have to pay 93 euros and 13 cents to load the full page of vogue.co.uk in Moscow using roaming charges. Now, I lied to you because you have this little clause here saying that if your costs exceed 59.50, so just cut off, right? So that means I would be paying 59.50 for seeing a wonderfully beautiful blank page, right? Now, I can get it for free, you know? Now, this is not cool. But okay, Vogue.co is wonderfully responsive and it's beautiful, but they're using all kind of retina images everywhere and they're loading them by default. So there is no, separation between retina and non-retina. So for the same amount of money, I can actually get 16 print edition of Vogue in Moscow, right? So, doesn't make sense. Now this is where the idea of these performance budgets come into play, right? You always include performance in project documents, and it could be something like, well, 550, 750K at most for the front page, maybe 20 HTTP requests. I want the page to start rendering, not necessarily finish loading, right? But start rendering under 1.1 seconds on the SL 16000, for example. Start rendering under 2 seconds on 3G, maybe. And the important content has to be in the first 14 kilobyte, right? So whenever somebody wants to add a feature, there are 3 options, right? You either optimize the feature to make it work within your budget, or you remove an existing feature, or you don't add the new feature. And the last one works like magic, right? And it doesn't take much time either, right? So this is why I do this little trick. Oh, this is being broadcasted, right? Oh, right. Well, let me see that somebody does this little trick, okay? So you say you have a client who is not concerned about performance at all, but you are, and obviously you have to advocate your users' needs. So you take this client's website, you ask them for your favorite competitor. So you have a competitor's website, and then you pre-cache hard in local storage, in app cache, in cache everywhere, the competitor's website, and run it against the brand new uncached client's website. Now the client's website will be significantly slower, right? But then they kind of see, yes, it is slow. Why the hell is it slow? Well, it's not cached, but I won't tell you. So this kind of increases sensitivity for performance, which is a good thing. So please, this guy is smart, so please use this technique as well. Sometimes it works. I'm just kidding. Now the question is, of course, so how fast is fast enough? We want to be fast, we want the website to be fast, but what does it mean to be fast enough? Well, if you're using web page speed, there is this notion of speed index, which basically is just an algorithmic value of how fast your website is. It doesn't say much. But what it does say is how fast you are starting rendering when your web page is loading. It's not about finished loading time, but actually more about the actual time it takes to start rendering. So if it's under 1,000, it's a good sign. And again, if you have the most important content in the first 14 kilobyte, it's a good sign too. And there are all these kind of different strategies as well, which are basically very similar thing. Right? Critical path view in the first 14K, interface response times under 100 milliseconds, and visual comparison works best to visualize performance. So now combining this all together, let's see how it could work in a real-life project. So this is The Guardian, and they did a big redesign a couple of years ago. Actually last year, I think, 2013, yes. It was a big project. It took a lot of time, a lot of resources, but they ended up with a really nice result. So let's see how they did it. So back in 2013, it had very specific requirements. They wanted to tackle dropping print circulation because they saw that the print circulation is dropping. So they wanted to tackle it with mobile, just trying to get as many visitors from mobile as possible. They wanted to replace the slow, rigid mobile and desktop sites. Of course, they have them separated. They're both slow and both not very usable, not very user-friendly. They wanted to focus specifically on mobile experience first, right? Long term, it was all about creating a new responsive client-side architecture. so that they can replace all the existing presences with one code base and one responsive site. So in their case, what worked best was a so-called mobile-first steel redesign. And they just took what they had already and built on top of it. So basically, they just forked the mobile side, optimized the hell out of it, introduced major UX improvements, performance improvements, content improvements, right? Really make it clean and polished, right? And then they started to kind of approach the tablet view, to grow from the mobile view to the tablet view, to see how much time it takes, how many resources it takes, how much money it takes, right? And then starting from tablet later on, kind of going to desktop, so that in the end they would cover the full spectrum from the small screen to the very large screen, and they could replace the existing sites, right? Because again, if you think about what we saw previously, well, you could just go ahead and create a tablet-optimized version, right? But then you didn't cover all the other bases, all the other cases. So starting with mobile, it really helps you to cover everything, from the very small screen to the very large TV screens. And they focus specifically on progressive enhancement. So who is familiar with the concept of progressive enhancement? Right. So it's a very simple concept. You start with basics, with core functionality, core content, core styles, core everything, and then you see what the user's browser is supporting and what not, and depending on that, you kind of add more stuff to it. But even if everything is broken, no JavaScript, no proper connection, and so on, you're still getting something, right? If you start the other way around, this is not going to be the same story. So progressive enhancement as a core of what they did. This is what the architecture looked like, and they made a very similar decision that TV Guide guys did in 1983. They created content APIs, but not only for the main database, but also for very specific parts of the site. So they had a weather API, they had a politics API, they had a sports API. So if one of the APIs goes down, well, the others are available still. And at the same time, other people can actually use these APIs to build apps on top of them, just reusing this content when paying the license fee, of course. So this is very comfortable because the content is just there, and it's up to designers, developers in the Guardian, but also outside the Guardian, of how it will be presented. So they had the content API, the main database. They have two write API and read API. Write API is the one that editors are using to submit articles, to edit content, and so on. And then this content would go to all these different places, like Android app, iPhone app, Windows Phone app, iPad app, and so on. Responsive website, obviously, and so on. Right? They identified the core content first. Again, talking about priority lists, right? They really took a lot of time to identify what core HTML means and what core CSS means. And this is what it was. Core content does not rely on JavaScript. So even if you don't have JavaScript, the content should be accessible. Only one main feature image is considered to be core content on the front page. So all the other images will not be loaded by default. They will be loaded later on. Because ratings, comments, and live scores depend on JavaScript, they're not considered to be core content. They use this technique I'll show in a bit for cutting the mustard, which means they're separating browsers into two groups, the smart browsers and the stupid browsers. Right? So stupid browsers emit a light version of the site, and the smart browsers get a proper version of the site. Web fonts are not considered to be core content because they are blocking the content from loading. How much time do I have, actually? Oh, 2 minutes. That's bad. Well, I started later anyway, so... Right. So now the thing is, we don't need to render the entire content, the entire page, in a certain threshold. We just have to start rendering it as fast as possible and to show the content above the fold as fast as possible. So they separated the full content into 3 parts. Core content, as we described, enhancement, and leftovers. Core content is HTML, CSS, basic stuff. Usable non-JavaScript enhanced experience. Enhancement is web fonts, widgets, images as well. Enhanced CSS, touch, geolocation, and JavaScript. And leftovers are things that most people don't care about at all, right? Advertising, third-party content, weather, widgets, and analytics and stuff like that. So if you know JavaScript, well, this is very easy to do. If you want to separate concerns this way, it's very easy. You can just load core content first, as fast as possible. You load enhancement on DOM content ready. That means the page starts rendering right away. The enhancement is loaded after the page started rendering already. And then you load leftovers on load, which means after the page has fully loaded, right? And that's all. That's a very simple architecture. So this is what it looks like. Nothing is blocking content from appearing. Enhancement is loaded, images are loaded, and web fonts are loaded, and so on. And all the leftovers are loaded later, right? Now that means for the tag guys in here, it means that for responsive images, well, you don't have the image tag, but you have lots of empty divs by default. And then they're being replaced by JavaScript as you go. And they also introduced this kind of real-time performance dashboard, which is really quite cute. So they had this in the entry. They had this nice dashboard of comparing performance, real-time performance, meaning the time it takes for the site to start rendering or start displaying in milliseconds, in seconds, and page views per minute, right? So the moment you see things like this happening, you start thinking, oh, wait a second, what's going on here? So, okay, you can actually immediately see that when it takes more time for the page to render, to start loading, the traffic drops as well, right? So that people who took care of, managers and marketing people, they said, oh, wait a second, now performance is important now, because we don't want this to happen too often, right? So please, let's keep performance good. Now, this is not so important. But they had, of course, this weird thing, like separating browsers into two groups thing going on. But how would you do it? Do you use Modernizer? Do you use like Wurfel, Device Atlas, which are weird and nasty and dirty, reliable sometimes, mostly not? Well, they used a very simple technique, feature detection, client-side feature detection, where they use these three lines of code to check if query select is in document, local storage is in window, and add event listener is in window as well. If it's all matches, then you have detected a smart browser, an HTML5 browser as they call it. It's i9+, Firefox, Opera, all the cool ones. And then all the stupid ones are, just getting a different experience. So they're getting the basic experience, right? Now, if you think about it, this is a perfect example of replacing Modernizer in many cases. Just with 3 lines of JavaScript, which is quite nice. And they actually took it from BBC, and BBC did lots of testing, so they know what they're doing. Now, web fonts is a different story entirely. So I spent the last 2 weeks figuring out how to deal with web fonts. And it's a nightmare sometimes, but they did something really cool. So this technique of grouping browsers into two groups, they call it cutting the mustard. So if it's a smart browser, it has cut the mustard. So it means, okay, dealing with web fonts, right. So the user comes to the page. Well, if a browser is stupid, it never gets any web fonts. If a browser is smart, but it doesn't support WoW, it doesn't get any web fonts. If it's smart, supports WoW, but doesn't have local storage available, it doesn't get any web fonts. It gets web fonts only if it's smart, supports WoW, fonts and local storage, and then it's showed. Have no time, 1 minute. That's very bad, indeed. That's cool. Now, the idea here is the following. You have this problem with content, with web fonts. Because if you want web fonts to load fast, you have to do some tricks. Because either you're waiting for the fonts to be loading, and then you have this experience of underlines for links first, and then first font appears, and second font appears, and then you can access the content. Or you can actually display the content right away in a fallback font, right, and then make a switch. But then you don't want to switch to web fonts happening too often, because it's annoying. Or you kind of store it somehow in local storage, and then it is available after all. But this takes a lot of trickery. But again, let's take a look at the result. Guardian users need to successfully complete 1 HTTP request to read the news. No excitement at all? Guardian users need to successfully complete 1 HTTP request to read the news. Okay? That's fine. Immediate start render time for an uncached page on iPhone 4 3G with 300 milliseconds round trip time is 0.79 seconds on mobile. for newspaper front page. With JavaScript loaded, well, it's 67 HTTP requests, 657K, which is still pretty decent, and it takes 0.72 seconds to load the page, right? Now, this is a really good result. Now, but you might be asking, so desktop should be faster, right? What's the reason why desktop is so slow compared to mobile? It's even worse than, desktop, mobile. Now, the problem is you had to add ads on the desktop view, so everything was slowed down later. So this is the only example for a site that performs better on mobile than on desktop for responsive site. But again, if you don't have to add ads, then you can have a really, really fast responsive site. And because the Guardian is fully open source, you can just fork it and use it right away. So if somebody tells you that responsive website can't be done fast, well, they are really damn liars, because it can be done. So you can just fork it and use it right away. So, just to finish up, I'm not finished yet.
Okay.
Because I want to finish with this.
Okay, just 1 minute.
1 minute, wonderful. Now, who knows what this is? You get a book if you guess what it is. All right, let's play the audio. So who remembers dial-ups? Right, the good old times. Now this is a nice one, right? Now why am I showing this? Well, some crazy guy actually tried to decode what happens as modems do handshakes, and he created this kind of a map of how it starts. And basically they're just talking, hey, how are you doing today, and stuff like that, right? So what kind of connection do you support, and so on and so forth. And they communicate, and then they kind of come up with a decision, okay, let's communicate this way. Now, when this was invented, HTTP was invented as well, right? 1991, and then we kind of got a renewal, 1999, with HTTP 1.1. Now, I'm not going to have a nice conclusion, because we don't have time, but the thing is, we have to reinvent HTTP. And basically, we're already there. Because HTTP 1.1 has some bad things that we have to fix. So we have reduction, you can use maximum 6 connections per domain, single request per connection, and so on. HTTP is slow, and HTTPS is even slower. But again, even if we all had 4G available everywhere, it wouldn't make the web inherently faster, because, well, even if you have 10 megabits per second everywhere, the page load time wouldn't decrease exponentially. But it does decrease exponentially if you reduce the network round trips. So the answer to this is speedy, or HTTP 2.0. It works. You can use it today because it's well supported in browsers, except Safari. But again, the new Safari that I think will be available soon will support it as well. And on the server side, you can install Apache and Nginx today as well. So you can have all the benefits, 50% more speed, right, today, just by installing Speedy. And many clients actually using it. Google is using it, WordPress.com, Cloudflare, and so on. So you can use it today. I don't have more time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vitaly.